The psychiatric hospital near Zurich sits quiet on this June afternoon in 1961 inside a modest house overlooking the lake. An 85-year-old man lies dying. His breathing has grown shallow. The cardiovascular system that carried him through 2 world wars, through decades of controversy, through a deliberate descent into what others would call madness, is finally failing. Carl Jung has perhaps hours left. Around him, the artifacts of a life spent mapping the invisible. Shelves of alchemical texts, notebooks filled with drawings of mandalas, photographs from his tower at Bollingen, where he carved stone like a medieval mystic. On his desk, unfinished correspondence about archetypes and the collective unconscious, concepts that will outlive him by generations, though academic psychology will spend those same generations trying to forget he existed. But here is what makes this death different from most. Jung chose to go where he is going, not death itself, but the territory death borders. 50 years earlier, he deliberately induced visions, conversed with entities that did not exist, documented his own unraveling. With the precision of a scientist dissecting a specimen, he went mad on purpose. He called it research. The question that will haunt his legacy, the question that makes his death more than the end of one controversial psychiatrist, is this: did he come back? Before we discover what Jung found in his own darkness and what it cost him to return, I want to ask you something. This is the kind of story that stays with you, and your support helps me tell more of them. If you're finding this compelling, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It genuinely makes a difference. And I'm curious, where in the world are you watching from today? Drop a comment and let me know. Now, to understand what happened to Carl Jung, we need to go back to where it started. Back to the moment a 3-year-old boy learned that mothers disappear. Switzerland, 1878. The village of Kleinhüningen near Basel, where the Jung family has recently settled after Paul Achilles, Jung accepted a pastoral position. The house is modest, appropriate for a reformed church minister whose salary barely supports his small family. Inside, a 3-year-old boy wakes to find his mother gone. The morning light filters through thin curtains. Carl calls for her. His voice echoes through empty rooms. His father appears instead, face drawn, eyes avoiding the child's questioning gaze. "Where is Mama?" The question receives no satisfactory answer. She has gone away. She is ill. She will return when she is better. But, to a 3-year-old, these words mean nothing. What they translate to is simpler and more terrible. The person who was supposed to always be there is not there. Emily Jung has been sent away. The official explanation involves her health, her nerves. In the medical terminology of the era, she suffers from nervous disorders requiring institutional care. The 3-year-old Carl will later remember this as the moment he learned the first and most terrible lesson of his life. The person who is supposed to be constant can vanish without warning. The weeks that follow blur together in Carl's memory. His father tries to maintain routines. Meals happen, though they taste like nothing. Bedtime comes, but sleep brings nightmares of abandonment. Carl develops a fear of the dark that will persist into adulthood. More significantly, he develops a distrust of love itself. If the person you love most can disappear, then love is not safety. It is a trap, a vulnerability waiting to betray you. He begins having a recurring dream. In it, he is in a meadow. His mother is there, but when he runs toward her, she transforms into something else, something frightening. Sometimes she becomes a tree with roots that reach for him. Sometimes she dissolves into water. The dream changes, but the essential terror remains constant. What appears safe and maternal hides something dangerous beneath. He is left with his father, Paul, a man slowly suffocating in his own vocation. Paul Jung came from a family of physicians. He chose the church instead, following a calling that somewhere in the years of parish work and theological doubt has stopped calling back. By the time Emily leaves for the hospital, Paul's faith is already dying. He prays dutifully, he delivers his sermons, but something essential has drained away, leaving only the habits of belief where belief itself once lived. Carl watches his father closely during this period. He sees the way Paul's face changes when he prays, how the words come out smooth and practiced, but the eyes remain empty. He witnesses his father studying scripture with the expression of a man searching for something he knows he will not find. Paul Jung is performing faith for his congregation, but he has lost the private conviction that once animated the performance. For young Carl, this creates an impossible equation. Mother is unreliable, capable of disappearing. Father is present but hollow, performing a conviction he no longer possesses. The child begins to fracture in response, developing what he will later call his two personalities. Personality number 1 is the son of a poor pastor, a schoolboy in a Swiss village, obedient and conventional. Personality number 2 is ancient, dignified, living in the 18th century, skeptical of everything personality number 1 accepts. This is not yet psychosis. It is adaptation. When your mother disappears and your father slowly dies inside while still walking around, you learn to trust your own interior more than the external world. You learn that consciousness can split and still function. You learn that what others call reality is negotiable. The child does not know he is rehearsing for the role he will play 50 years later, when he will split himself deliberately, systematically, as an act of research. All he knows now is that he has two selves, and neither one fully believes in the world the adults pretend is solid. Carl discovers he can retreat into personality number 2, when personality number 1 faces something unbearable. During church services, while his father drones through sermons that convince no one, Carl sits in the pew and becomes the 18th century gentleman. This other self wears a powdered wig and buckled shoes. He carries a cane. He finds the 19th century vulgar and disappointing. From this position, the boring church service becomes merely a curiosity, something to observe with detached amusement rather than endure. The split deepens. Personality number 2 has opinions about architecture, about manners, about the decline of culture. Where do these opinions come from? Carl does not know. They simply arrive, fully formed, as if he is remembering rather than inventing. Later, much later, he will build an entire theory around this experience. The idea that we carry within us the accumulated wisdom and memory of our ancestors, that consciousness is not individual but collective. But now he is simply a strange child, too quiet, too watchful. The other village children sense something off about him. They do not invite him to their games. He does not mind. He has better company in his own head. Emily eventually returns from the hospital. She does not return healed. Throughout Carl's childhood and adolescence, she remains a figure of instability, subject to dark moods and stranger enthusiasms. The Preiswerk family, Emily's people, claim a heritage of spiritualist sensitivity. Her grandfather was a minister who claimed to see ghosts. Her cousins hold seances. Emily herself seems to have access to something other people lack, though whether this is insight or illness remains perpetually unclear. When Emily returns, she brings with her an atmosphere that Carl will later recognize as dissociation. Some days she is present, warm, the mother he remembers. Other days she is elsewhere, her eyes focused on something only she can see. She speaks of dreams with the certainty other people reserve for waking events. She warns Carl about dangers she perceives but cannot quite articulate. She has premonitions that sometimes come true and sometimes do not, and she treats both outcomes as equally meaningful. For Carl, growing up in this atmosphere means living with doubled reality. There is the official world of his father's church, where sermons explain a rational God and moral order. Then there is his mother's world, where the walls are thinner, where things bleed through from somewhere else. He learns to navigate both. He learns to appear normal while suspecting that normal is a lie everyone tells, to avoid looking at what actually surrounds them. He begins noticing that he can sense his mother's moods before she expresses them. If she is about to have one of her dark days, he knows it the night before. He does not know how he knows. The information simply arrives, like his personality number 2's opinions. This makes him useful to his father, who relies on Carl to warn him when Emily needs space, when she needs company, when she needs to be left alone with whatever visitors arrive from the other side of consciousness. At 11, walking home from school one day, another boy pushes him. Carl falls, striking his head on the curb. The blow is hard enough to stun him. As he lies there, something crystallizes. If he is injured, he will not have to go to school. School is where personality number 1 is forced to perform. If he is injured, he can retreat into personality number 2. He begins fainting. Not constantly, but regularly enough that school becomes impossible. Teachers and doctors worry. His father worries, though Carl Jung's worry has the quality of going through motions. Carl is sent home. For months, he escapes into books, into fantasy, into the dignified 18th century gentleman who lives inside his head and who finds the 19th century Swiss village insufferably banal. The fainting episodes have a pattern. They come when Carl faces something he does not want to face, a difficult exam, a social situation, his father's disappointed silence. Just before consciousness leaves, there is a moment of perfect relief. He is about to escape. Then nothing. Then he wakes to concerned faces and is sent home, excused from whatever he was dreading. His father grows increasingly worried. They cannot afford doctors, but Paul takes Carl to physicians anyway, borrowing money they do not have. The doctors find nothing physically wrong. They suggest nervousness, perhaps a weak constitution. They recommend rest, fresh air, less stimulation. Carl obediently rests. The fainting continues. He begins to enjoy his invalid status. Personality number 1 would feel guilty about this deception, but personality number 2 finds it entirely reasonable. If the world insists on being tedious and demanding, why not simply excuse yourself? He reads voraciously. His father's library contains theology, but also history, philosophy, literature. Carl devours it all, educating himself while supposedly recovering. Then one day he overhears his father talking to a visitor. Paul's voice carries the weight of resignation. He worries that Carl will never amount to anything, that the family cannot afford an invalid son. The words strike Carl with the force of the original blow to his head. His father thinks he is finished. His father, who has already given up on faith, is now giving up on him. The shock is profound. Carl realizes with sudden clarity that he has been lying to himself. The fainting is not something happening to him. It is something he is doing, a choice disguised as a symptom. And if it is a choice, it can be unchosen. Carl walks to his father's study. He opens his Latin textbook. He begins to study. When the fainting sensation approaches, he pushes through it. The sensation is powerful, seductive. It promises escape. But behind it, he can feel his own will, his own decision to disappear. He refuses the decision. The sensation intensifies. Sweat breaks out on his forehead. His vision darkens at the edges. He keeps studying. The darkness recedes. He studies for an hour, then 2. The fainting does not come. The next day, he returns to school. The sensation comes twice during lessons. Both times he pushes through. Within weeks, the fainting episodes cease entirely. He will later recognize this as the moment he learned that psychological symptoms, even ones that feel utterly real, can be willed away if the stakes are high enough. But he will also recognize something darker. That part of him wanted to disappear and had to be fought into staying. That battle between the part that wants to vanish and the part that insists on remaining will define his entire life. He has learned now that he can control consciousness itself. He does not yet know this is the skill set of a future psychiatrist. He only knows that he has proven he is stronger than whatever tried to stop him. The year is 1895 and Carl Jung, now 20, enters the University of Basel to study medicine. The decision surprises no one. Medicine is a practical choice, a path to financial security that his impoverished family desperately needs. His father has died the year before, and Carl carries the weight of being the man who must now rescue the Jung household from poverty. Paul Jung's death was slow and bitter. The faith that left him years before never returned. On his deathbed, Paul spoke not of heaven, but of waste, of years spent preaching what he could not believe. Carl sat with him during those final weeks, watching the man who taught him to distrust external authority die without finding any internal authority to replace it. The lesson was clear: emptiness at the center will eventually consume you. Medicine makes sense. What does not make sense, what Carl himself cannot quite explain, is the strange excitement he feels reading his textbooks. Not anatomy, not physiology, but something else. When he reaches the section on psychiatry, he experiences what he will later describe as a pounding heart, a rush of understanding. Psychiatry, the textbook explains, is the study of diseases of the personality. Personality, the word arrests him. He has spent his childhood navigating between two personalities. Now he learns there is an entire medical discipline devoted to this territory. More than that, the textbook, written by Richard von Krafft-Ebing, describes psychiatry as subjective, as necessarily bound to the personality of the physician. Unlike surgery, which is objective, psychiatry requires the doctor to bring his entire self to the work. Carl sees immediately that this is where his split consciousness, his navigation between personality number 1 and personality number 2, is not a liability but a qualification. He has lived inside this mystery. Now he will study it. The night he makes his decision, Carl cannot sleep. His small student room feels too confined for what is expanding inside him. He has found it. Not just a career, but a vocation in the truest sense. His father sought meaning in a God who never answered. Carl will seek meaning in the human psyche, which at least has the advantage of definitely existing, even if its depths remain as mysterious as any heaven or hell. His professors are less convinced. Psychiatry in the 1890s occupies the basement of medical prestige. It is where physicians go when they lack the talent for real medicine. Psychiatric hospitals are warehouses for the incurable. There is little treatment, less hope. Carl's professors try to dissuade him. He ignores them. He has recognized his vocation the way his father once recognized a calling to ministry. The difference is that Carl's calling comes not from a God whose existence he doubts, but from his own fractured consciousness seeking to understand itself. His classmates are more direct in their skepticism. Why would anyone choose to spend their days with lunatics? The work is depressing, the pay poor, the prospects minimal. Carl tries to explain about personality, about consciousness, about the mystery of how minds can break. They look at him with the same expression the village children wore when he was young. Something is off about him. They cannot name it, but they feel it. He does not mind. He has never needed their understanding. What matters is that he has found the door into the territory he was born to explore. December 1900. Carl Jung, now 25 years old, arrives at the Burghölzli Psychiatric Hospital on the outskirts of Zurich. The building sits on a hill overlooking the city, a massive institution housing hundreds of patients diagnosed with dementia, precox, hysteria, manic depressive insanity, general paresis. Inside, the wards smell of urine and carbolic acid. Patients shuffle through corridors or sit motionless in day rooms, minds gone to places from which institutional psychiatry has no map to retrieve them. Jung's first day is overwhelming. He is shown the wards, introduced to staff given a white coat that marks him as a doctor rather than a patient. The distinction feels thinner than he expected. As he walks through the day room, patients call out to him. Some plead for release, others warn him of conspiracies. One elderly woman grabs his hand and tells him she is the Queen of Prussia, that enemies have imprisoned her here, that he must help her reclaim her throne. He looks into her eyes. They are not the eyes of someone performing delusion. They are utterly convinced. Whatever world she inhabits, in that world, she is indeed royalty in exile. Jung finds himself wondering, what if she is right? Not literally, but psychologically. What if her delusion is a symbolic truth, an expression of some inner nobility that has been dethroned in her actual life? The thought is unprofessional, absurd even, but it will not leave him. All around him, patients are constructing elaborate realities. The traditional psychiatric view is that these are simply broken brains producing noise. But Jung keeps returning to the same question. What if they are communications? What if madness is not the absence of meaning, but meaning in code? Jung has accepted a position as assistant physician under Eugen Bleuler, the hospital's director. Bleuler is a rare figure in turn-of-the-century psychiatry, a man who believes that the utterances of psychotic patients are not merely noise but communications that can be decoded. Where other psychiatrists see only broken brains producing gibberish, Bleuler insists there is meaning, however obscured. He has recently begun using the term schizophrenia, splitting of the mind, to replace the more hopeless diagnosis of dementia, precox. Bleuler becomes Jung's model for a different kind of psychiatry. Most senior physicians visit the wards briefly, issue orders, retreat to their offices. Bleuler spends hours with patients, listening to their ramblings with the intensity of a man solving puzzles. He teaches Jung to look for patterns, for themes that repeat, for the logic hidden inside apparent illogic. Under Bleuler's mentorship, Jung begins developing his clinical eye. A patient speaks in word salad, stringing together phrases that seem random. But Jung notices that certain words cluster together, that there are emotional valences. The patient who cannot speak coherently about his mother can speak fluently about gardens. When Jung suggests the garden might represent the mother, the patient becomes agitated. The coherence breaks down further. Jung learns that he is close to something. Jung thrives here. The patients whose delusions baffle or bore other physicians fascinate him. He spends hours listening to their word salads, their paranoid systems, their grandiose declarations. Where he once navigated between his own two personalities, he now navigates between consensus reality and the private realities of the mad. He discovers that if he can suppress his own ego enough, if he can enter into the patient's world without insisting on its impossibility, something like communication becomes possible. One patient believes he is Christ returned. He speaks in parables, blesses the nurses, predicts apocalypse. Other physicians dismiss him as a simple messianic case, common enough in psychiatric hospitals. Jung sits with him differently. Instead of challenging the delusion, he asks questions. What is it like to be Christ? What does Christ see when he looks at the modern world? What does Christ feel about being confined in a hospital. The patient looks at Jung with eyes that are simultaneously mad and clear. He says Christ weeps for the world, that humanity has forgotten its divine origin, that people worship machines and money instead of God. He says Christ came to remind humanity of its spiritual nature, but was killed for it, and now has returned to find the same rejection. The hospital is Golgotha, he says. The doctors are the Roman soldiers. The other patients are the thieves crucified beside him. The patient's answers are startling. Beneath the religious grandiosity is a sophisticated critique of modernity, of the loss of meaning, of the way industrial society has amputated the sacred dimension of existence. The patient is not simply mad. He is mad in a particular way, a way that addresses real cultural problems even if the form is delusional. Jung asks, if you are Christ, why do you not perform miracles? The patient smiles sadly. He says he performs the miracle of consciousness every moment, that to remain aware in this hell is the greatest miracle. He says Christ's true miracle was not walking on water but maintaining love in the face of hatred, maintaining meaning in the face of meaninglessness. The hospital tries to make him forget he is Christ, tries to convince him he is simply ill. That is the crucifixion happening now, the murder of divine consciousness by rational diagnosis. Jung leaves the session troubled. Is the patient simply psychotic, or has he stumbled onto something real? The identification with Christ is clearly pathological, an inflation of the ego that cannot be sustained. But the content of what the patient says, the critique of modernity, the insistence that consciousness itself is sacred, is this not what Jung himself believes? The difference is that Jung can move between mythological and ordinary consciousness, can think with archetypes without being possessed by them. The patient has been overwhelmed, has lost that crucial distance, but what he has lost his sanity to is not meaningless. It is, in its own way, a kind of truth. Jung begins to see that insanity is not random but patterned, that patients construct their delusions from the same archetypal material that religions and myths use. The Christ patient, the Queen of Prussia, the man who believes he is being poisoned by electromagnetic rays. All of them are drawing on collective human imagery, twisting it through their personal suffering into private mythologies. He begins developing a method. Rather than simply noting symptoms, he creates word association tests. He speaks a word to a patient and measures how long before they respond, noting what words create delays or strange reactions. He discovers what he calls complexes, clusters of emotionally charged associations that distort consciousness. A patient hesitates on the word mother, another on knife. These delays reveal something, Jung argues, about the architecture of the unconscious mind. He publishes his findings. The papers attract attention, including attention from Vienna, where a physician named Sigmund Freud is developing his own theory of the unconscious. The word association experiments become Jung's breakthrough. He sets up a laboratory, uses stopwatches to measure response times down to fractions of seconds. He compiles lists of neutral words and emotionally charged words. He demonstrates that certain words consistently produce delays, changes in breathing, physiological responses the patient cannot control. A young man comes in for testing. Jung begins the word list. Neutral words get quick responses. Then Jung says, water. The patient pauses, his breathing changes. When he finally responds with drowning, his voice has altered. Jung notes this, continues the list. Later, he returns to water-related words, each time the same pattern. Jung interviews the patient, asks about water. Eventually, the story emerges. A younger brother drowned when the patient was supposed to be watching him. The guilt has shaped the patient's entire psyche, creating a complex around water, drowning, responsibility. Jung shows that this complex can be detected objectively, measured, used diagnostically. It is one of his first contributions to psychiatry, one that will bring him recognition. But more importantly, it confirms what he suspected. Beneath conscious awareness, the psyche organizes itself around emotional wounds, and these wounds can be mapped. But even as Jung establishes himself as a promising young psychiatrist, something else is happening. Among his patients is a young Russian woman named Sabina Spielrein. She is 19 when she arrives at Burghölzli in 1904, diagnosed with hysteria, subject to violent outbursts. Jung takes her case. She is intelligent, educated, desperate to be understood. He applies his talking cure. She improves. They begin an intense relationship that will remain forever contested. Sabina is unlike any patient Jung has treated. Where most patients resist analysis, she throws herself into it with intellectual passion. She is studying medicine herself, wants to understand the mechanisms of her own disturbance. Jung finds in her an equal, someone who can follow his thinking, challenge it, extend it. Their sessions go long, stretching beyond professional boundaries. She tells him about her childhood, about abuse, about sexual feelings mixed with shame and rage. Jung listens with an intensity that is both clinical and personal. He recognizes in her account something of his own childhood splitting, the same sense of fractured identity, of consciousness divided against itself. He tells her this. It is a violation of professional distance, but it helps her. She begins to see her symptoms not as inexplicable madness, but as rational responses to irrational circumstances. The boundaries blur further. Sabina develops intense feelings for Jung. He does not discourage them. Later, he will claim this was controlled, part of the treatment, what Freud will call transference. But letters that will surface decades later suggest something more complicated. They address each other with intimacy, discuss dreams that seem mutually erotic, plan a future that sounds less like doctor-patient and more like lovers. Years later, after Jung has become famous and Spielrein has become a psychoanalyst herself, she will tell others that Jung was her first love, implying more than a professional relationship. Jung will claim he behaved ethically, that any erotic feelings were part of the transference neurosis he was analyzing. What is certain is this. Sabina Spielrein represents Jung's first extended encounter with what he will later call the anima, the feminine principle in a man's unconscious. She is brilliant, artistic, fluent in the kind of symbolic thinking that will become central to Jung's work. She is also vulnerable, dependent on him, willing to enter into the kind of psychological intimacy that his marriage to Emma Rauschenbach, which takes place in 1903, does not provide. Emma is wealthy, practical, an heiress whose fortune makes Jung's career possible. The marriage is, in many ways, a strategic decision. Jung needs money to continue his work. Emma needs a husband appropriate to her social station. They are fond of each other, certainly, but there is nothing passionate about the arrangement. Emma provides stability, children, social position. What she does not provide is the kind of dangerous intimacy Jung craves. With Emma, Jung is personality number one, responsible, conventional, the promising young doctor building a career. With Sabina, he is something else, something closer to personality number two, willing to explore territories that professional Jung knows he should not enter. Sabina is dangerous, alive with the same psychic instability Jung carries inside himself, but has learned to hide behind professional competence. She writes him letters that blur the line between clinical observation and seduction. She dreams of bearing his child, of creating with him what she calls a new mythology. Jung is simultaneously thrilled and terrified. He wants what she offers, but he also knows it will destroy him if he fully accepts it. The relationship with Sabina will end badly. She will leave Burghölzli in 1905, continue her studies, become an analyst in her own right. But years later, she will begin telling people about her treatment with Jung, implying that he seduced her, that he took advantage of her vulnerability. Jung will panic. He is, by then, famous, married, with children, the crown prince of psychoanalysis. A scandal would destroy everything. He writes desperate letters to Freud seeking advice on how to handle a former patient threatening his reputation. Freud, who has his own complicated relationships with female patients, advises discretion, damage control. Jung eventually pays Sabina to remain quiet, though exactly what happened between them will never be fully resolved. The whole episode reveals something Jung has not yet admitted to himself, that he is drawn to the very chaos he is supposed to cure, that part of him recognizes in the patient's madness something familiar, something he has been suppressing in himself since childhood. Vienna, February 1907. Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud meet for the first time in Freud's study at Berggasse 19. They talk for 13 hours. Neither can believe the other exists. For Jung, now 32, Freud represents everything he has been groping toward. Here is a man who takes the unconscious seriously, who has mapped the mechanism of dreams, who insists that beneath the rational surface lies a roiling world of drives and conflicts. For Freud, 51 years old and embattled, Jung represents hope. The psychoanalytic movement Freud is building is small, mostly Jewish, suspect in the eyes of establishment medicine. Jung is Swiss, Protestant, already respected in academic psychiatry. He is also brilliant, charismatic, capable of bringing psychoanalysis out of its Viennese ghetto into wider acceptance. The study where they meet is cramped, filled with ancient artifacts. Freud collects antiquities, Egyptian and Greek figurines that crowd every surface. Jung finds this significant. Freud's consulting room is a museum, surrounded by symbols of dead civilizations. It fits with the man's theories. Everything is past, everything is childhood, everything is archaeology of the personal unconscious. They talk about dreams first. Freud has just published The Interpretation of Dreams, a book that sold poorly but that Jung considers revolutionary. Freud explains his method. Dreams are disguised wish fulfillments, primarily sexual, censored by the superego. The analyst's job is to decode the symbols, find the repressed desire beneath. Jung pushes back gently. In his work with psychotic patients, dreams often contain material that does not seem personal, that draws on myths and symbols the patient has never encountered. How does Freud explain this? Freud suggests the patient absorbed the material unconsciously from culture, from art, from overheard conversations. Everything can be traced back to personal experience. Jung is not convinced, but he does not press the point. Not yet. He is too dazzled by the encounter itself, by the fact that someone of Freud's stature takes his work seriously, invites him into collaboration. They become, in rapid succession, colleagues, collaborators, father and son. Freud begins calling Jung his crown prince, the man who will lead psychoanalysis after Freud himself is gone. They travel together to America in 1909 to deliver lectures at Clark University. On the ship crossing the Atlantic, they analyze each other's dreams, an intimacy both intellectual and emotional. Jung is dazzled. For the first time since his actual father died, he has found an authority he can believe in. The voyage to America is 7 days of intense conversation. They walk the deck discussing theory while other passengers watch the ocean. Freud tells Jung about the early days of psychoanalysis, the hostility from medical establishment, the accusations that he is a sexual obsessive. Jung reassures him that the resistance is temporary, that truth will prevail. They analyze dreams each morning. Freud shares a dream involving complex family dynamics. Jung applies Freudian interpretation, finding sexual symbols, Oedipal themes. Freud nods, pleased. Then Jung shares one of his dreams. In it, he is exploring a house. The upper floors are modern, well-furnished. But as he descends, the architecture grows older. The basement is medieval. Below that, a cave filled with prehistoric artifacts and skulls. Jung explains that the house represents the psyche. The upper floors are personal consciousness. The deeper levels are something else, something older than individual experience. He calls it the collective unconscious. Freud listens, then suggests the skulls represent death wishes, probably toward family members. Jung insists they mean something else, something about the structure of human consciousness itself. The disagreement is minor, polite, but it marks the fault line that will eventually break them apart. But beneath the collaboration, tension is already growing. Freud insists that sexuality is the fundamental drive, that all neuroses trace back to repressed libido. Jung finds this reductive. His work with psychotic patients has convinced him that there are deeper layers to the unconscious, that sexuality alone cannot account for the universal symbols and mythological themes that appear in the delusions of patients who have never read mythology. While Freud sees the Oedipus complex, Jung sees something older, more primal. The theoretical difference masks a deeper conflict. Freud needs a son and successor. Jung needs a father, but also needs to kill that father to become himself. The psychoanalytic movement Freud has built has cult-like qualities. There is an inner circle, a committee that guards orthodoxy. Deviations from Freudian theory are treated not as scientific disagreements but as resistance, as signs that the dissenter has not been sufficiently analyzed. Jung begins to chafe. He is being asked to subjugate his own thinking to Freud's, to accept sexual theory as dogma rather than hypothesis. In 1909, still close, they have an argument during the American trip. Jung wants to discuss recent findings in parapsychology, cases of supposed psychic phenomena. His mother's Preiswerk heritage has left him open to such possibilities. He has witnessed too many uncanny coincidences, too many patients whose dreams predicted future events to dismiss it all as superstition. Freud dismisses it as nonsense. Parapsychology is where scientific credibility goes to die. Psychoanalysis is already suspect in the eyes of mainstream medicine. The last thing it needs is association with spiritualism and table rapping. Jung presses. Why should material science be the only acceptable framework? What if consciousness is not confined to individual brains? What if there are forms of connection, communication, that current science cannot measure? Freud's face grows cold. This is exactly the kind of thinking that will destroy psychoanalysis, turn it into mysticism, render it intellectually useless. Jung feels the rebuke as a child feels a father's disappointment. But beneath the hurt, anger rises. He is not a child. His ideas are not symptoms of resistance. Freud wants disciples, not colleagues. Suddenly there is a loud crack from a bookcase in the room. Both men startle. Jung claims this is an example of externalized psychic tension, what he calls a catalytic exteriorization phenomenon. The emotional intensity in the room has manifested physically. Freud insists it was the wood contracting, nothing more. Jung predicts it will happen again. Within moments there is a second crack. Jung looks at Freud triumphantly. Freud looks alarmed. The incident is minor, absurd even, but it reveals the split. Jung is drawn to the occult, to the possibility that consciousness extends beyond individual brains. Freud is committed to materialism, to keeping psychoanalysis within the boundaries of respectable science. Neither will move toward the other's position. The break is now inevitable, though it will take 3 more years to complete. Back in Zurich, Jung tries to integrate Freudian theory into his work, but increasingly it does not fit. He treats patients whose dreams contain symbols they could not have learned. He encounters synchronicities, meaningful coincidences that Freudian theory dismisses, but that seem important. A patient dreams of a scarab beetle, an Egyptian symbol of rebirth. During the session, Jung hears tapping on the window. He opens it, and a rose chafer, the closest Swiss equivalent to a scarab, flies into the room. Coincidence? Possibly. But the effect on the patient is profound. She has been stuck in rationalist rigidity. The uncanny event breaks something open in her. How does Freud explain such events? He cannot, except by denying their significance. But Jung witnessed it. More than that, he has experienced it himself, the sense that consciousness and matter are not as separate as materialism insists. By 1912, Jung has written a book, Wandlungen und Symbole der Libido, later translated as Psychology of the Unconscious. In it, he redefines libido not as sexual energy but as generalized psychic energy. He argues that myths are not just disguised Oedipus stories but autonomous productions of what he is beginning to call the collective unconscious. He sends the manuscript to Freud. Freud reads it with growing alarm. This is not a refinement of psychoanalytic theory. It is a replacement. The book is Jung's declaration of independence. He knows what he is doing, knows this will end his relationship with Freud, but he cannot continue subordinating his discoveries to Freudian orthodoxy. The book argues that the Oedipus complex, which Freud considers universal, is actually just one manifestation of a deeper pattern, the hero's struggle to separate from the mother and claim individual identity. This pattern appears in myths worldwide, long before Greek tragedy, suggesting it comes from something deeper than personal family dynamics. Jung analyzes myths from cultures around the world: Sumerian, Hindu, Christian, Native American. In all of them, he finds the same core narratives: the descent into the underworld, the battle with the monster, the union of opposites, the sacred marriage. These stories, Jung argues, emerge from the collective unconscious, the deep layer of the psyche shared by all humanity. Freud reads this as betrayal. Jung has taken psychoanalysis and turned it into mythology, replaced science with mysticism. The sexual theory, which Freud considers his greatest discovery, has been demoted to just one aspect of a much vaguer psychic energy. This is unacceptable. The letters between them grow cold, then hostile. Freud accuses Jung of neurotic resistance, of failing to fully analyze his father complex. Jung accuses Freud of turning psychoanalysis into a religion with himself as prophet. The break becomes inevitable, then final. By 1913, they are no longer speaking. Jung resigns as president of the International Psychoanalytic Association. Freudians close ranks, declaring Jung a traitor who has abandoned science for mysticism. Jungians begin forming their own societies. Jung is now 38 years old. He has lost his intellectual father, the community he helped build, the identity he carried as Freud's chosen successor. He has gained his independence, but independence feels less like liberation than abandonment. He begins having visions, vivid, intrusive, unlike anything he has experienced even during his childhood dissociation. In October 1913, he is on a train, staring out the window at the Swiss countryside. Suddenly the landscape transforms. He sees a flood covering Europe, a monstrous tide drowning cities, turning the sea blood red. Bodies float in the contaminated water. The vision lasts minutes, then fades, leaving Jung shaken. The vision returns. Again and again through the fall and winter, Jung sees Europe destroyed by water and blood. He thinks he is going mad. The visions have the quality of hallucinations, unbidden and overwhelming. But they also have a coherence, a symbolic logic. Water is the unconscious in dream language. Blood Is life force, violence, sacrifice? Is his own unconscious warning him of something? Or has he finally crossed the line from psychiatrists studying madness into madness itself? He considers checking himself into a hospital. He knows the signs of schizophrenia, has treated hundreds of patients with the diagnosis. He is experiencing what looks like the prodromal phase: vivid hallucinations, break with reality, inability to trust his own perceptions. Emma watches him with growing fear. He has become distant, distracted, sometimes talking to himself. Then in August 1914, World War I begins, and Jung realizes his visions were not personal psychosis, but some kind of premonition drawn from the collective unconscious of Europe. The flood he saw was not literal water, but the unconscious, breaking through civilization's constraints, drowning the rational order in blood and chaos. This realization does not comfort him. If anything, it terrifies him more. Because if the visions were real in some sense, then consciousness is far stranger and more permeable than even his break with Freud suggested. Jung makes a decision. He will go further. He will stop resisting the visions and instead deliberately induce them. He will map his own unconscious the way an explorer maps unmapped territory. He will conduct what he calls his confrontation with the unconscious. He does not tell Emma, not fully. He reduces his patient hours, telling colleagues he needs time for research. Each afternoon he goes to his study, sits in his chair, and waits. He deliberately relaxes the normal ego controls that keep unconscious material suppressed. At first, nothing comes. He sits in silence, feeling foolish. Then, slowly, images begin appearing. Not thoughts, but visions, as vivid as external reality. He begins each afternoon by sitting quietly and allowing images to arise. At first, nothing comes. Then, slowly, figures begin appearing: an old man named Elijah, a beautiful blind woman named Salome, a black snake. Jung does not try to interpret them. He talks to them. He asks them questions. They answer. The answers are not what he expects. Elijah says things Jung does not consciously know. Salome has insights into Jung's psychology that startle him with their accuracy. The first figure is Elijah, an old prophet with a white beard. He appears spontaneously, speaks in archaic language. Jung asks who he is. Elijah says he is the voice of the ancient, the carrier of wisdom. With him is Salome, young and beautiful but blind. She loves Elijah. Jung is disturbed by this pairing, the old man and the young blind woman. What does it mean? He does not interpret yet. Instead, he enters into dialogue. He asks Elijah about the visions of destruction. Elijah says the old world is dying, that a new aeon is beginning, that the transition will be violent. Jung asks what he should do. Elijah says to descend, to go down into the depths and bring back what he finds. Salome speaks less, but when she does, her words are more personal. She tells Jung she loves him, that he is a god. Jung recoils. This is clearly projection, his own unconscious creating a figure who worships him. But Salome insists. In the realm she inhabits, the distinctions Jung makes do not hold. God and man, conscious and unconscious, self and other, all of these boundaries are illusions. Over months, the technique deepens. Jung descends through layers of his own mind. He encounters a figure he calls Philemon, an old man with the wings of a kingfisher. Philemon becomes his primary guide, teaching him that psychic contents have objective reality, that thoughts and images are not merely products of the brain, but entities with their own existence. Philemon appears one afternoon as Jung sits in his garden. The figure walks across the grass, clear as any physical person. Jung watches, uncertain if he is hallucinating. Philemon introduces himself, says he has come to teach. Over the following months, Jung has conversations with Philemon that last hours. Philemon explains that thoughts are like people, that they have their own lives, that consciousness is not a product of the brain, but something that exists independently. Jung begins to develop a technique he will later call active imagination. He allows figures to appear, then interacts with them as if they are real. He asks questions, argues with them, learns from them. It is not the same as dreaming because he remains conscious, capable of directing the encounter. But it is also not waking thought because the figures have autonomy, say things Jung does not expect, teach him things he did not know. He begins drawing mandalas, circular images that emerge spontaneously and seem to have ordering, centering effects on his chaotic mental state. Every morning he wakes and draws the mandala that presents itself. Some are simple geometric patterns, others are complex symbolic systems with quaternities, crosses, flowers, architectural structures. He does not understand what they mean, but drawing them stabilizes something. On days when he does not draw, the visions become overwhelming, threatening to dissolve his ego entirely. The work is exhausting, terrifying. Jung never knows, emerging from these sessions, whether he has been exploring the unconscious or hallucinating. His children notice that he is different, distant, sometimes speaking as if he is not quite present. Emma watches, frightened, but also fascinated. She has married a psychiatrist who is now applying his clinical skills to his own near dissolution. He documents everything. He buys a large red leather journal and begins transcribing his visions, illuminating them like a medieval manuscript. The work is meticulous. He writes in careful calligraphy, paints images of what he sees. He is simultaneously the scientist observing the experiment and the subject undergoing it. This is the central paradox of his method. He maintains just enough ego structure to document his own ego dissolution. If he lets go completely, he will become one of his own patients, lost in psychosis. If he maintains too much control, the unconscious will not reveal itself. He is balancing on the edge and he knows it. And there is someone else watching. During this same period, Toni Wolff enters Jung's life, initially as a patient, then as something far more complex. She has her own psychological crises. Jung treats her. But Toni is not like Emma. Where Emma is practical, grounded in domestic reality and the raising of their 5 children, Toni is intellectual, willing to follow Jung into the depths he is exploring. She becomes his collaborator in the descent. She also becomes his lover with Emma's knowledge and reluctant acceptance. Toni arrives at Jung's practice in 1910, depressed, suicidal after her father's death. Jung treats her, and she improves. But unlike most patients who complete treatment and leave, Toni stays. She begins studying analytical psychology, wants to become an analyst herself. Jung takes her on as a student. The relationship intensifies. By 1914, when Jung begins his confrontation with the unconscious, Toni is his daily companion in the work. Emma knows. Jung does not hide it. He argues that he needs both women, that Emma represents his connection to outer reality, while Toni represents his connection to the inner world. Emma represents wife and mother. Toni represents what he will later theorize as the anima, the soul image, the feminine principle that mediates between ego and unconscious. The argument that this is necessary for his work does not make it less devastating for Emma. She is raising 5 children, managing the household, seeing her own patients as a training analyst. Now she must also accommodate her husband's mistress, who attends family dinners, vacations with them, occupies a room in their house. Emma considers leaving but cannot. She believes in Jung's work, has invested her own life in it. She also has nowhere else to go. Divorce for a woman of her class and era would mean social death. This triangular arrangement, which will last for the rest of Jung's life, is not merely personal drama, it is also methodology. Jung believes he needs both women, that Emma represents his connection to outer reality, while Tony represents his connection to the inner world. Emma represents wife and mother. Tony represents what he will later theorize as the anima, the soul image, the feminine principle that mediates between ego and unconscious. The argument that this is necessary for his work does not make it less devastating for Emma, who will spend decades accommodating a mistress in her home, at family dinners, in her husband's bed. But the arrangement does serve Jung's purpose. Throughout 1914, 1915, 1916, while Europe tears itself apart in the trenches, Jung tears himself apart in his study. He fills notebook after notebook with transcriptions of his visions. He paints images of what he sees: castles, demons, gods, mandalas. He is simultaneously the scientist observing the experiment and the subject undergoing it. This is the central paradox of his method. He maintains just enough ego structure to document his own ego dissolution. One vision is particularly significant. Jung finds himself in a wasteland, a destroyed city. He meets a figure called the Red One, a demonic presence who demands Jung murder something. Jung refuses. The Red One insists. They struggle. Finally, Jung understands that what must be killed is the hero within himself, the inflated ego that believes it controls consciousness. He performs a symbolic murder, and the wasteland begins to bloom. The vision lasts hours. When Jung emerges, he understands something fundamental. The ego must die for the self to be born. This will become central to his later theory of individuation, the process by which a person becomes whole. But in 1916 it is not theory. It is lived experience, terrifying and transformative. By 1916 something begins to shift. The visions, which were chaotic and threatening, begin to organize themselves. Patterns emerge. Jung starts to see that the figures he has been encountering are not random but archetypal, that they appear in the myths and religions of cultures worldwide: the old wise man, the destructive feminine, the shadow, the self as unifying center. He has found what he went looking for, evidence that beneath the personal unconscious lies something deeper, a collective layer shared by all humanity, populated by universal symbols he will call archetypes. He emerges from the confrontation with the unconscious having survived it. He has not gone mad, or rather, he has gone mad in a controlled manner and returned. He will spend the rest of his life, the remaining 45 years, until his death, elaborating on what he discovered during those 3 years. Every major concept in Jungian psychology, every book he will publish, every theoretical innovation is essentially an unpacking of what happened to him between 1913 and 1916. But the cost is already visible. Jung has proven something to himself about the nature of consciousness, but he has also proven that he is willing to sacrifice conventional human relationships, conventional sanity, conventional anything in pursuit of that knowledge. Emma will live in the shadow of Tony for the rest of their marriage. His children will grow up with a father who is sometimes present and sometimes lost in worlds they cannot enter. And Jung himself will never again be certain where the boundary lies between insight and delusion, between discovering truth about the psyche and constructing elaborate mythologies about his own experience. The war ends in 1918, Europe begins rebuilding, Jung begins publishing. The first major book to come directly from his confrontation with the unconscious is Psychological Types, which appears in 1921. The book introduces the concepts that will make Jung famous in the popular imagination: introversion and extroversion, the 4 functions of thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition. These ideas seem practical, almost banal compared to the mystical visions that generated them. But that is Jung's genius. He has found a way to translate his strange journey into concepts that appear scientific, measurable, useful. The book argues that people have different psychological types, different ways of relating to the world. Introverts direct energy inward toward their own inner processes. Extroverts direct energy outward toward objects and other people. Combined with 4 functions, thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition, this creates 8 basic types. The system is elegant, applicable, the kind of thing that can be taught and used clinically. The book is a success. It establishes Jung as more than just a former Freudian, more than a mystic wandering in psychological wilderness. He is building his own system, his own school. Students begin arriving at his house in Küsnacht. He begins offering seminars in English for wealthy Americans drawn to his ideas about meaning and mythology. The house fills with doctors, artists, wealthy seekers. Emma, trained as a Jungian analyst herself, sees patients in a separate wing of the building. Toni Wolff has her own practice nearby and remains a constant presence. Jung begins traveling. He goes to North Africa in 1920, seeking direct experience of a culture less rationalized than Europe. In Tunisia, he visits mosques, watches Islamic prayer, experiences the quality of consciousness in a culture still connected to its religious roots. The landscape itself affects him profoundly. The desert seems eternal, unchanged for millennia, a physical manifestation of the timeless unconscious he has been exploring in his inner work. He travels with a small group, including an interpreter. They visit ancient ruins, Roman amphitheaters half buried in sand. Jung stands in these spaces and feels the weight of accumulated history. Civilizations rise and fall, but something beneath remains constant. The collective unconscious, he thinks, is like this desert, ancient, unchanging, the foundation on which all temporary structures are built. One afternoon, sitting in a courtyard in Tunis, he has a vision of himself as a medieval alchemist. The vision is so vivid that for moments he is uncertain which time period is real. He is wearing robes, studying manuscripts by candlelight, mixing substances in vessels. The alchemist is working on the opus, the great work of transformation. Jung realizes the alchemist is himself, that across centuries the same work continues. The attempt to transmute consciousness, to turn the lead of ordinary awareness into the gold of enlightenment. The vision passes, but its effect remains. Jung begins paying closer attention to local culture, to the rhythms of Islamic life. He notices that prayer happens 5 times daily, structuring time around sacred moments. This is not the secular time of modern Europe, where hours are uniform and purpose-neutral. This is sacred time where certain hours belong to God, where consciousness shifts according to ritual. He observes how men gather for prayer, how their bodies move in synchrony, bowing, prostrating. The movements are choreographed, ancient, repeated billions of times across centuries. Jung recognizes this as participation mystique, the dissolution of individual consciousness into collective experience. In the moment of prayer, the individual Muslim becomes part of something larger, merged with the Ummah, the community of believers stretching across space and time. This is what Europe has lost, Jung thinks. The Enlightenment dissolved these collective rituals, replaced sacred time with secular time, transformed prayer into embarrassment. Modern Europeans are individuals, autonomous, rational, but they are also isolated, disconnected from the collective currents that give life meaning. No wonder neurosis is epidemic in Europe. People have been severed from the roots that once sustained them. Then, in 1924-1925, he goes to New Mexico to visit Pueblo tribes, seeking confirmation of his theory about the collective unconscious. He travels by train across America, watching the landscape transform from East Coast cities to Midwestern plains to Western deserts. America fascinates and appalls him. It is so young, so disconnected from deep time. Americans have no sense of the ancient, no relationship to the layers of history that Europeans take for granted. But the Pueblo people are different. They have lived in the same locations for centuries, maintaining rituals that predate European arrival. Jung hopes to find in them a living connection to the archetypal layer he has been mapping theoretically. He arrives at Taos Pueblo in New Mexico, is introduced to tribal elders, begins the slow work of building trust. He meets with a Pueblo elder named Ochwie Biano, Mountain Lake. The name itself strikes Jung, Mountain Lake, a union of opposites, the solid mountain and the flowing water. They sit on a roof of an adobe building, looking out over the landscape. The desert stretches to mountains. The sky is impossibly blue. Jung feels exposed here, vulnerable under the huge sky. Europeans build walls, create interiors. Here, everything is exterior, open, connected to earth and sky. Mountain Lake speaks slowly, through an interpreter, though Jung suspects Mountain Lake understands more English than he admits. They talk about the differences between white and Pueblo culture. Mountain Lake says white people are crazy, always restless, always seeking something. Pueblo people know what they seek, know their place in the cosmic order. Jung asks what the Pueblo people believe about the sun. Mountain Lake explains that Pueblo people perform their religious rituals to help the sun rise each day, that without their prayers the sun might fail. The sun is their father, he says. They are sons of the sun. If the sons do not help the father will grow weak and die, then all life will end. Jung is struck by this, not because he believes the sun needs human ritual, but because Mountain Lake's explanation reveals a different relationship between consciousness and cosmos. In Western thought, the sun operates by physical law, indifferent to human activity. In Pueblo thought, consciousness and cosmos are not separate. Ritual maintains the order of things. This is not primitive superstition, Jung realizes. It is a different ontology, one in which consciousness plays a constitutive role in reality. Mountain Lake continues. He says white people think with their heads, tapping his forehead. This makes them cruel, disconnected. Pueblo people think with their hearts, pressing his hand to his chest. This keeps them connected to all living things. Jung recognizes in this statement something profound about Western consciousness. The Cartesian split between mind and body, between subject and object, has created a particular kind of alienation. Pueblo consciousness, still rooted in participation mystique, has not yet made this devastating split. They sit in silence for a while. Jung watches clouds move across the sky. He thinks about his own culture, about Zurich and Vienna and London, about factories and railways and electric lights. All of this progress, all of this mastery over nature rests on the assumption that consciousness and cosmos are separate, that humans can manipulate matter without participating in it. But what if that assumption is wrong? What if the Pueblo people have preserved something essential that Europeans have lost? Mountain Lake says something else. Something that will haunt Jung for years. He says that white people's eyes are cruel, always looking for something to take. Pueblo eyes are soft, looking to participate. Jung feels accused, recognized. His whole project, analyzing the unconscious, mapping archetypes, is it not also a kind of taking? He wants to extract knowledge from these people, add it to his theory. He is the white man with cruel eyes even when he thinks he is being respectful. He leaves New Mexico feeling both confirmed and disturbed. Confirmed because the Pueblo symbols, the four directions, the union of earth and sky, the emphasis on ritual maintaining cosmic order all appear in the alchemical texts and in his own visions. The collective unconscious is real, he is more certain than ever, but disturbed because he also sees that his own relationship to this material is contaminated by his culture. He is trying to understand participation mystique from the position of someone who has lost the capacity for it. He is like a blind man developing a theory of color. When he observes that Native American religious symbols resemble European alchemical symbols, he takes this as proof that he has discovered something real, not merely projected his own ideas onto other cultures. The spiral, the four directions, the uniting of opposites, all of these appear independently in cultures that have had no contact. Critics will later argue that Jung sees what he expects to see, that his method involves circular reasoning where the theory generates the evidence for itself. Jung dismisses such criticism as rationalist blindness. In 1928, Jung discovers alchemy. A sinologist friend, Richard Wilhelm, sends him a Chinese alchemical text, The Secret of the Golden Flower. Jung reads it with recognition. The alchemical process of transformation, the symbolism of opposites uniting the goal of creating the philosopher's stone, all of it maps precisely onto what he experienced during his confrontation with the unconscious. He sees immediately that medieval alchemy was not primitive chemistry, but a projection of psychological processes. The alchemists were trying to transform consciousness, not lead into gold. They were conducting the same experiment Jung conducted, but externalized, disguised as metallurgy. This discovery transforms Jung's work. He begins collecting alchemical manuscripts, spending large sums on rare Latin texts. His library at Küsnacht fills with books on Hermeticism, Gnosticism, medieval philosophy. He spends years translating obscure alchemical treatises, looking for the psychological insights hidden in their bizarre imagery. The Rosarium Philosophorum, an illustrated alchemical text from 1550, becomes particularly important. It shows a king and queen representing masculine and feminine principles, going through stages of union, dissolution, purification, and final integration. The sequence begins with the royal couple meeting, clothed, separate. They join hands, they remove their clothes, becoming vulnerable, naked before each other. They enter a bath together, immersing themselves in the waters of the unconscious. They unite sexually, the hieros gamos, the sacred marriage. They die, dissolving into a single hermaphroditic corpse. They decompose the nigredo, the black putrefaction. From this death, something new begins to grow, a soul rising from the rotting body, an integration of opposites, the birth of the philosophical child. Jung sees this as a map of the individuation process, the journey toward psychological wholeness. The king is conscious ego, the queen is anima, the soul image. Individuation requires their union, but not a simple merger. First comes recognition, then vulnerability, then descent into the unconscious, the bath, then union, then death of the old identity, then decomposition of everything you thought you were, and only then rebirth as something new, something that transcends the original opposites. He will eventually write a book-length commentary on the Rosarium, The Psychology of the Transference, published in 1946. The book uses the alchemical images to explore what happens in analysis between analyst and patient. The transference, where the patient projects onto the analyst parental images, desires, authority, is not just something to interpret and dissolve. It is itself an alchemical vessel, a container where transformation happens. The analyst and patient together enter the bath, undergo the dissolution, risk the death of fixed identities. If the work succeeds, both emerge transformed. It is dangerous, intimate, easily confused with actual romance. Jung knows this from experience, from Sabina, from Tony, from the countless women patients who fall in love with him during treatment. The book is controversial. Freudians see it as Jung abandoning science entirely, disappearing into mysticism and medieval superstition. Even some Jungians are uncomfortable with how far he goes, with his suggestion that the transference is not just psychological, but also in some sense spiritual, alchemical, a literal transformation of souls. To outsiders, this looks like an elderly psychiatrist going off the rails into occultism. To Jung, it is confirmation that he has found the hidden tradition, the underground river of symbolic thought running beneath the surface of Western rationalism. The alchemists were the true psychologists of the medieval period, working with the unconscious even though they lacked modern terminology. They called it solving and coagulating, mortificatio and vivificatio, but they meant what Jung means by the death and rebirth of consciousness. He spends years reading alchemical texts, filling notebooks with parallel quotations. One column, alchemical Latin, the other column his own psychological interpretation. The work is painstaking, obsessive. Emma worries about him. He sits in his study for hours, surrounded by obscure books in languages most people can no longer read, drawing connections that seem far-fetched, insisting that medieval metallurgy was really depth psychology in disguise. But Jung is convinced the evidence is overwhelming, at least to him. When an alchemist speaks of purifying gold, of removing dross and impurities, he is really speaking about purifying consciousness, removing neurotic attachments and false identities. When the alchemical texts warn that the work is dangerous, that many have died attempting it, they mean psychological death, the dissolution of ego that Jung experienced during his confrontation with the unconscious. The philosopher's stone, the goal of all alchemical work, is not a substance but a state, the integrated self, the union of conscious and unconscious, the wholeness that the individuated person achieves. One text particularly captivates him, the Splendor Solis, a 16th century manuscript filled with vivid illustrations. The images show flasks containing transforming substances, kings drowning in water, corpses rotting and regenerating, peacocks spreading iridescent tails, white queens and red kings uniting. Jung studies these images for months, lets them work on him the way he once let Philemon and Elijah work on him. The images are alive, he decides. They are not just illustrations, but active symbols, capable of inducing transformation in whoever contemplates them properly. He begins to understand alchemy not as a failed science, but as a different kind of science, one that included the observer in the experiment. Modern chemistry eliminates the subjective, seeks objective truth, independent of who performs the experiment. Alchemy embraced the subjective, recognized that the person conducting the opus is transformed by it. The alchemist projects his own unconscious contents into the material he works with, and in watching the material transform, he watches himself transform. It is projection and integration, externalization and internalization, a method Jung recognizes because it is essentially what he did during his confrontation with the unconscious. His seminars become stranger, more ambitious. He lectures on Nietzsche's Zarathustra for years, using it as a text to explore modern Western humanity's confrontation with the death of God. The seminars run from 1934 to 1939, meeting regularly at Jung's house in Küsnacht. Participants come from across Europe and America, wealthy analysans and serious students, all drawn to Jung's method of reading Nietzsche as a prophetic document of the modern psyche. Jung approaches Zarathustra not as philosophy, but as psychology. Nietzsche's declaration that God is dead is not, for Jung, a metaphysical claim but a psychological fact. Western consciousness has lost its connection to the numinous, to the transcendent ground that once organized meaning. Into this vacuum, Nietzsche proposes the Übermensch, the Superman, who creates his own values. But Jung sees disaster in this proposal. The self cannot bear the weight of being its own creator. Without connection to something greater, whether you call it God, or the collective unconscious, or the self, consciousness collapses into inflation or despair. Zarathustra himself, Jung argues, is Nietzsche's unconscious speaking, a compensatory figure emerging to balance Nietzsche's conscious rationalism. And Nietzsche's final breakdown into psychosis proves Jung's point. When you sever consciousness from its unconscious roots, madness follows. Nietzsche went mad because he tried to be his own God. Jung, who walked to the same edge, survived because he maintained dialogue with the figures from the unconscious, because he did not claim to create them but to discover them. The seminars are intense, running hours, Jung speaking in a mixture of German and English, digressing into personal anecdotes, alchemical parallels, case studies from his practice. Students struggle to follow. Some find it brilliant, a new way of reading that reveals hidden dimensions of the text. Others find it wildly undisciplined, Jung projecting his own obsessions onto Nietzsche. Both are probably right. He begins dream seminars where he analyzes participants' dreams in front of audiences, demonstrating his method of amplification, connecting personal symbols to mythological parallels. A woman presents a dream. She is in a garden. There is a snake. She is frightened, but also fascinated. Jung does not interpret this as Freud would, as a phallic symbol revealing sexual anxiety. Instead, he amplifies. He talks about the snake in Genesis, in Greek mythology, in alchemical imagery. The snake is transformation, is healing, is the wisdom that comes from below. The garden is Eden, is the hortus conclusus of medieval mysticism, is the inner sanctuary where transformation happens. The woman begins to cry. She says Jung has named something she knew but could not articulate. This is Jung's gift and also his danger. He can articulate the mythological dimension of personal experience in ways that feel revelatory. But he can also lead people into symbolic inflation, where they start seeing themselves as characters in cosmic dramas rather than as human beings with human problems. Another seminar participant, a man troubled by recurring nightmares of persecution, presents his dreams. Jung listens carefully. The dreams have a paranoid quality. Hidden enemies, conspiracies, threats from every direction. Jung asks about the man's waking life. The man is a businessman, successful, rational, proud of his lack of superstition. Jung suggests that the dreams are compensatory, that the man's conscious rationalism has repressed the irrational, which now returns as persecutory fantasy. The interpretation makes sense psychologically, but Jung goes further. He suggests the man needs to develop a relationship with his shadow, the disowned aspects of personality. He needs to recognize that he carries within himself the same irrationality, the same capacity for darkness that he projects onto dream enemies. The work is not to eliminate the shadow, but to integrate it, to become whole by accepting all of what he is. The man resists. He does not want to be irrational. That is what he has spent his life escaping. But Jung presses, you cannot escape the unconscious. You can only enter into relationship with it. Either you make the darkness conscious or it will direct your life unconsciously. The man leaves the seminar troubled, uncertain. Months later, Jung will hear that the man suffered a breakdown, left his business, spent time in a clinic. Did Jung's intervention help or harm? It is impossible to say. The unconscious, once stirred, does not move in straight lines. Students take notes. The Bollingen series begins publishing Jung's collected works, massive volumes covering word association, psychological types, archetypes, alchemy, synchronicity. The books are not easy reading. Jung's style is dense, elusive, assuming familiarity with everything from Gnostic texts to medieval philosophy to contemporary physics. He is writing for people who are willing to follow him into obscurity, who will put in the work to understand. This limits his academic influence but creates a devoted following. Institutions begin forming around him, training programs in analytical psychology, Jungian societies, conferences. By the 1930s, there is something that looks like a Jungian movement, complete with training analysts, publications, international conferences. Jung is ambivalent about this. He wants his work to continue, but he also fears dogmatism, the transformation of analytical psychology into another rigid system. He has broken from Freud precisely because Freudian psychoanalysis became doctrinaire. Now he watches his own students beginning to treat his ideas as sacred texts rather than provisional maps. He tells them, "I am not a Jungian." The statement is both true and disingenuous. He has created a comprehensive system, published volumes elaborating it, trained analysts in its methods. Whether he calls himself a Jungian or not, the movement exists and it bears his name. The question is whether it will remain alive, capable of evolution, or will ossify into orthodoxy. Jung hopes for the former, fears the latter, knows he cannot control it. But just as this structure solidifies, history intrudes. In Germany, the Nazis come to power in 1933. One of their projects is to reorganize professional associations, bringing them under ideological control. This includes the General Medical Society for Psychotherapy, an international organization of which Jung is a prominent member. The society's president, Ernst Kretschmer, resigns rather than submit to Nazi coordination. Jung is asked to take his place. He accepts. The decision will haunt the rest of his life. Jung's stated reasoning is that by remaining president, he can protect psychotherapy as a discipline, can keep the international society functioning even as its German branch falls under Nazi control. He also believes he can provide cover for Jewish psychotherapists, help them continue practicing even as Nazi racial laws begin excluding them from professional organizations. His intentions may have been good. The results are disastrous. He also edits the Society's journal, Zentralblatt für Psychotherapie. Under his editorship, the journal publishes articles distinguishing between Jewish and Aryan psychology. Jung himself writes about fundamental differences between Germanic and Jewish unconscious structures, claiming that the Jewish psyche, shaped by millennia of diaspora, differs from the rooted Germanic psyche. These statements are complex in their intent and devastating in their effect. Jung appears to be arguing that Jews and Germans have different psychological needs, which could be read as justification for separate treatment. He is not calling for persecution, but he is creating intellectual framework that can be used to justify it. Worse, he remains in his position even as it becomes clear what the Nazis are doing. Even as Jewish colleagues are expelled from German psychoanalytic societies, Jung will spend years after the war insisting he was misunderstood, that he was trying to protect Jewish psychotherapists, that his statements about racial psychology were descriptive, not prescriptive. Some Jewish colleagues will confirm he helped them. Others will say his actions, whatever his intent, gave cover to Nazi cultural policy. The debate remains unresolved, ugly, a permanent stain on his legacy. What is clear is that Jung's willingness to see profound differences between different ethnic unconscious structures made him vulnerable to being used by an ideology based on those same supposed differences. The Nazi period also reveals something about Jung's personality. He is capable of astonishing psychological insight into individual patients. He can navigate the symbolic terrain of dreams and myths with extraordinary skill, but he is blind to certain social and political realities. His theory of archetypes, which makes him sensitive to universal human patterns, also makes him strangely insensitive to the specifics of historical evil. He sees Hitler as a personification of the Wotan archetype, the Germanic god of storm and frenzy, as if identifying the mythological pattern explains or even excuses the actual crimes. In 1936, Jung publishes an essay titled Wotan, arguing that Hitler's rise represents the eruption of an ancient Germanic archetype from the collective unconscious. The essay is disturbing in its detachment. Jung writes as if observing a natural phenomenon, a volcanic eruption of the psyche. He notes that Wotan is a god of storm and ecstasy, of war and poetry, and that the German people are gripped by this archetypal possession. He describes how Wotan was repressed during Germany's Christianization, how the old god was driven underground but never destroyed. Now, Jung argues, Wotan has returned, possessing an entire nation. The mass rallies, the ecstatic devotion to the Führer, the militarism and will to dominate, all of this is Wotan erupting from the collective unconscious of the Germanic peoples. Hitler is not creating this energy, Jung suggests. He is channeling it, giving it form, becoming the vessel through which an ancient archetype manifests. The analysis is psychologically sophisticated. Jung is identifying real patterns, real resonances between Nazi imagery and pre-Christian Germanic mythology. But what he does not adequately address is that this possession is killing people, destroying democracies, preparing for catastrophic war. His tone is analytical, almost admiring of the archetypal power he witnesses. He seems more interested in being proven right about the collective unconscious than in confronting the moral horror unfolding. Some colleagues read the essay as a warning. See what happens when archetypes possess a culture. Others read it as apologetics. Hitler cannot be held responsible because he is merely an instrument of Wotan. Jung insists it is neither, that he is simply describing psychological facts. But the distinction between description and justification becomes dangerously thin when describing atrocities. To say that evil has archetypal roots does not make it less evil, does not reduce anyone's responsibility to resist it. By 1945, when the war ends and the full horror of the Holocaust becomes known, Jung faces accusations of having been a Nazi sympathizer. He issues statements denying it, insisting his membership in German psychotherapy organizations was strategic, that he helped Jewish colleagues when he could. The accusations do not destroy his reputation, but they complicate it. For the rest of his life, he will be a controversial figure, honored by some, condemned by others. The war ends, but Jung's work continues. He is now 70 years old, an age when most people retire. He publishes some of his most ambitious works during this final phase. Ion, published in 1951, explores the figure of Christ as psychological symbol, arguing that Christ represents the self-archetype, the unifying center of the psyche. But Jung also explores the shadow of Christ, the figure of the Antichrist, suggesting that Christianity's emphasis on light and goodness has created an unconscious accumulation of denied darkness. Answer to Job, published in 1952 when Jung is 76, argues that God needs humanity to become conscious, that the Book of Job reveals an unconscious God requiring human consciousness to complete divine development. The book is shocking in its thesis. God is not omniscient, not perfectly good. God has a shadow capable of tormenting Job without cause. Only through human consciousness reflecting on divine action does God become aware of his own darkness. The book outrages religious authorities and delights readers looking for spiritual meaning outside traditional theology. Jung receives letters accusing him of blasphemy, of psychological reductionism, of destroying faith. He receives other letters thanking him for making religious ideas psychologically meaningful, for showing that God and psyche are not separate realms, but intimately connected. In 1944, Jung suffers a severe heart attack. He nearly dies. During his illness, he has what he describes as a mystical experience, a vision more vivid than anything he experienced during his confrontation with the unconscious. He finds himself high above the earth, looking down at the planet from space. The sight is overwhelming, the earth a beautiful blue sphere floating in cosmic darkness. And then he becomes aware of a temple, a massive stone structure floating in space. He approaches it, knows that inside he will finally learn the meaning of his life, the answer to every question he has pursued for decades. But just before entering the temple, his doctor appears in the vision. The doctor tells Jung he must return to Earth, that his time has not come. Jung feels devastation. He does not want to return. The earthly life seems small, insignificant compared to what awaits in the temple. But he has no choice. The vision fades. He wakes to find himself back in his body, back in his bed, weak and in pain. Jung recovers but is devastated. He felt he was about to finally understand everything. Being pulled back feels like exile from enlightenment. He becomes depressed, wishes he had been allowed to die. The earthly life, which once seemed so important, now seems like a prison. The experience deepens his conviction that consciousness survives death, that there are realities beyond the material world. It also confirms his method. The visions during his illness resemble the visions during his confrontation with the unconscious 30 years earlier. He has found a way to reliably access whatever that realm is, dream or symbol or actual metaphysical dimension. The question of which it is, Jung now insists, is unanswerable and possibly meaningless. What matters is that the psyche operates as if these realities exist, and working with them has therapeutic and transformative effects. In 1948, the C.G. Jung Institute is founded in Zurich, formalizing the training of Jungian analysts. By the 1950s, Jung's ideas are spreading into wider culture. Joseph Campbell begins publishing his work on comparative mythology, drawing heavily on Jungian concepts of the hero's journey and archetypal patterns. The Myers-Briggs type indicator, based directly on Jung's psychological types, begins being used in corporate and educational settings. Jung's introversion-extroversion distinction enters everyday language. People who have never read Jung use Jungian concepts without knowing their source. Emma dies in 1955. She has been Jung's partner for 52 years, has borne his children, tolerated his affairs, collaborated on his work, developed her own expertise in Grail mythology and the anima concept. Her death removes the stable center of Jung's domestic life. Tony Wolff has died 2 years earlier, in 1953. Jung is now 80, living alone in the house at Küsnacht with his memories and his books and his visitors who still come seeking wisdom. Emma's death affects Jung more than he expected. Despite Tony, despite his affairs, and his theoretical claims about needing both women, Emma was the foundation. She managed his life, protected his work time, mediated between him and the world. Without her, the house feels empty. He wanders rooms that echo, his children visit, but they have their own lives. He is alone in a way he has not been since childhood. He begins a final project, an autobiography. He works with Aniela Jaffe, who takes dictation, asks questions, helps organize the material. But this is not a conventional autobiography. Jung refuses to write about external events except as they relate to inner development. He wants to tell the story of his confrontation with the unconscious, wants to explain what he discovered when he went deliberately mad. The book will be titled Memories, Dreams, Reflections. It will be published after his death and become his most widely read work, the primary source through which millions of readers encounter Jung. But the autobiography is also a final act of myth-making. Jung is now telling the story of his life the way he wants it remembered, emphasizing certain events, interpreting others, constructing a narrative in which everything leads, inevitably, to his discoveries. Scholars will later note that some of the memories are questionable, that some of the dreams may have been revised in retrospect. But for Jung, this is not dishonesty. It is working with the material the way he always has, amplifying, finding the patterns, creating the narrative that makes sense of the chaos. He continues working, writing, seeing visitors. His tower at Bollingen, which he built starting in 1923 and expanded over decades, remains his retreat. The tower is medieval in style, built of stone he carved himself without electricity or running water. He goes there to paint, to carve inscriptions in Latin, to sit by the lake and think. It is the physical embodiment of his method, a structure he built with his own hands that connects him to something timeless, archetypal, beyond the modern world he increasingly finds alien. The tower has grown over the years, each edition representing a stage of his development. The original structure was a simple round tower, a primitive dwelling. He added a second tower when he realized he needed more space for his inner work, then a third section creating a courtyard. Finally, an upper story added after Emma's death, a private space where he can be completely alone. He carved stone with his own hands, inscriptions in Latin, alchemical symbols, images from his visions. The physical labor was important. It grounded him, connected him to something older than psychology, older than modernity. Medieval stonemasons carved cathedrals. Jung carved his tower. Both were religious acts, attempts to make the invisible visible, to give form to the sacred. By 1960, Jung's health is failing. He suffers from circulatory problems, his legs swelling, his breathing labored. His mind remains sharp, but his body is shutting down. He makes final revisions to memories, dreams, reflections, dictating changes to Agnella Jaffe, worrying that he has not explained adequately, that readers will misunderstand, that his most important insights will be dismissed as the ravings of an old mystic. He corresponds with scholars and students, writing letters in his cramped handwriting, answering questions about archetypes and synchronicity, offering interpretations of dreams sent to him by strangers who hope the master will illuminate their darkness. He does his best, but he is tired. 85 years of consciousness, of paying attention to the invisible, has exhausted him. He is ready to see what lies beyond, ready to enter that temple from his 1944 vision that he was forbidden to enter then. He watches the modern world with a mixture of interest and dread, convinced that humanity has technological power without psychological wisdom, that the shadow of the collective unconscious is rising in forms like nuclear weapons and totalitarian movements. The Cold War terrifies him. Americans and Russians, each convinced of their righteousness, each projecting their shadow onto the other, each capable of destroying civilization. This is the danger he has been warning about for decades. Unconsciousness armed with power. He reads newspapers, follows the space race, watches on television as Yuri Gagarin orbits the Earth. Humanity is reaching for the stars while still ignorant of the depths within. We can split atoms, but not integrate our psyches. We can build rockets to the moon, but cannot navigate the territory 3 inches behind our foreheads. The imbalance is catastrophic. Jung thinks. We are children, playing with weapons that can end the world. In his final months, he receives visitors. Former students, colleagues, friends, they sit with him in his study, surrounded by his books and artifacts. He speaks slowly now, pausing to catch his breath, but when he talks about the unconscious, about archetypes, about the self, his voice strengthens. This is what matters, he tells them. Not his personal life, not whether he was right about every detail, but the central insight. Consciousness must expand to include the unconscious, or we will be destroyed by what we do not know about ourselves. One visitor asks him what he believes happens after death. Jung smiles, says he does not believe, he knows. Knows what? That consciousness continues, that the psyche is not produced by the brain, but merely filtered through it, that death is a transition, not an ending. The visitor asks for proof. Jung shakes his head. There is no proof, not in the scientific sense. But there is experience, his own and that of countless patients who reported visions at the moment of death, who seemed to move towards something rather than into nothing. The spring of 1961 arrives. Jung is now 85. The cardiovascular disease that has been slowly weakening him accelerates. He spends more time resting, often in his bedroom, looking out at the lake. The view has been his companion for decades. The water changing with seasons and weather, reflecting sky, holding depths. Like consciousness itself, he thinks. The surface is visible, but beneath, mysteries. His children visit more frequently now. They know the end is near. They sit with him, hold his hand, speak of ordinary things. He loves them, has always loved them, though he was not a conventional father. They grew up in the shadow of his work, in a house filled with strange visitors and stranger conversations. Did they suffer for it? Probably. But they also witnessed something rare, a man who devoted himself utterly to understanding consciousness, who sacrificed comfort and convention for truth. On June 6th, he wakes weak. The nurse helps him sit up. He drinks a little water. He seems present but also distant, as if already partly elsewhere. Around noon, his breathing changes, becomes irregular. The family gathers. They do not speak much. There is nothing left to say. Jung's eyes close. His breathing slows, stops. On June 6th, he dies at home in Küsnacht. The death is peaceful, expected. The household has been preparing for weeks. When it comes, there is sadness but not shock. An era has ended. The moment of death, those who are present will later report, feels significant. The room seems to change, to become charged with something. One daughter will say she felt a presence, as if her father was still there but in a different form. Another will say she saw light, though the curtains were drawn. These reports are subjective, unprovable, exactly the kind of thing Jung spent his life taking seriously, while his critics dismissed them as wish fulfillment. Later that day, as news of Jung's death spreads, a storm comes over Zurich. Lightning strikes a tree near his house at Bollingen, splitting it. Coincidence or synchronicity? One final meaningful coincidence marking the death of the man who devoted his later years to studying such events? There is no way to prove it means anything. But those who believe in Jung's work will see it as confirmation. The psyche and matter are not separate. Consciousness and cosmos interpenetrate, and the death of a man who understood this can register in the physical world. The obituaries are respectful and divided. Some call him one of the great thinkers of the 20th century, a man who restored soul to psychology. Others call him a mystic who betrayed the scientific foundations of psychiatry, whose concepts are unverifiable and possibly meaningless. The Nazi controversy is mentioned in most of them. unresolved, a shadow that will follow his reputation into the future. What Jung leaves behind is massive and contradictory. 20 volumes of collected works covering everything from word association experiments to alchemical symbolism. The Red Book, still unpublished, sitting in a bank vault where his family has placed it because they are not sure the world should see his most personal visions. A network of Jungian institutes training analysts in his methods. A popular culture increasingly saturated with concepts like introvert and extrovert, shadow and archetype, even when people using these terms have no idea they come from Jung. But the deeper legacy is harder to quantify. Jung modeled something that modern Western culture had declared impossible, that a person could descend into the chaos of the unconscious and return not destroyed but transformed. He turned his own potential madness into a research program. He insisted that the symbolic and mythological thinking that modernity tried to eliminate as primitive was actually essential to psychological health. He argued that meaning was not something imposed by religion or ideology, but something that emerged from the depths of the psyche itself. Whether he was right is still being argued. Academic psychology largely abandoned Jung decades ago, viewing his work as too subjective, too willing to substitute interpretation for evidence. But depth psychology, mythology studies, and religious studies all still draw on his concepts. 12-step addiction recovery programs use his idea of shadow work. Filmmakers use his hero's journey. Corporations use his personality types. Jung is everywhere and nowhere, his ideas absorbed into culture, but often divorced from their source. And then in 2009, nearly 50 years after his death, the Red Book is finally published. The Jung family, after decades of protecting it, agrees to make it available. The book is massive, bound in red leather, filled with Jung's calligraphy and paintings from his confrontation with the unconscious. It is not scholarly, it is not clinical, it is strange and beautiful and disturbing. It shows what Jung actually did during those 3 years, how he worked, what he saw. The publication causes a sensation. Scholars realize they have been interpreting Jung's later work without access to the source material. The Red Book shows that Jung's descent was more chaotic, more genuinely on the edge of psychosis than his later theoretical writings suggested. It also shows that the archetypes and the collective unconscious were not abstract concepts Jung invented, but patterns he encountered, or believed he encountered, in his own depths. The images are overwhelming. Philemon appears, his wings spread, speaking words of alien wisdom. Demons and gods populate the pages. Mandala after mandala, each one a snapshot of Jung's psychic state on a particular day. The text is written as a dialogue, Jung conversing with figures who seem to have independent existence. Reading it, one cannot escape the question, was Jung exploring the collective unconscious, or was he simply hallucinating? Whether what Jung experienced was discovery or invention remains the central question. Did he find something real about the structure of the human psyche, or did he create an elaborate mythology and convince himself and others it was truth? The question may not have an answer. Jung himself would say the distinction is false, that myths are how the psyche reveals its structure, that truth in psychology is not the same as truth in chemistry. What cannot be questioned is that Jung staked everything on this wager. He sacrificed his relationship with Freud. He risked his sanity. He hurt the people closest to him, especially Emma, in pursuit of this knowledge. When a student once asked him if he believed in God, Jung replied, "I don't believe I know." The statement is either profound arrogance or profound honesty. Jung had gone to the edge of consciousness and come back. He did not believe in the unconscious. He had been there. The tower at Bollingen still stands. Visitors can go there, can see the stone Jung carved, the inscriptions in Latin, the simple rooms where he worked. The house at Küsnacht still overlooks the lake. The C.G. Jung Institute continues training analysts. His collected works sit on shelves. But the real inheritance is less tangible. It is the idea that madness is not only something to cure, but sometimes something to enter, that the symbols in dreams are not just disguised wishes, but messages from a deeper wisdom, that the goal of life is not adjustment to society but individuation, becoming fully oneself, even if that self is strange and contradictory, and does not fit conventional categories. Jung believed that modern Western culture had made a terrible mistake, that in gaining technological mastery, it had lost access to the symbolic thinking that gives life meaning. He believed the rise of fascism and totalitarianism came from this loss, from unconscious forces breaking through in destructive forms because conscious culture had no container for them. He believed the only solution was for individuals to do the work he had done, to confront their own unconscious, to integrate the shadow, to find within themselves the symbols that connect them to something larger than ego. Whether this is wisdom or delusion is the question each person must answer. Jung cannot answer it for anyone else. He can only stand as an example, a man who went as far into inner space as anyone has documented going and came back with reports. The reports are not scientific in the way physics is scientific. They cannot be replicated in laboratories. But they can be tested in the only laboratory that matters for psychology, which is lived experience. Millions of people over the past century have found that Jung's concepts illuminate their own inner lives, help them make sense of their dreams, give them a framework for understanding their contradictions. And millions of others have found his work unhelpful or incomprehensible, have rejected his mysticism and his mythologizing. Both responses are valid. Jung did not create a system that works for everyone. He created a system that works for people who, like him, find that ordinary consciousness is not enough, who sense something beneath the surface, who need a language for inner experience that goes deeper than behaviorism or neuroscience can reach. The house overlooking the lake where Jung died has become quiet again. The patients and visitors have stopped coming. The books remain on the shelves. The tower at Bollingen stands empty more often than occupied. The Red Book has been published, its secrets revealed. The collective unconscious, if it exists, continues operating whether or not anyone believes in it. The archetypes, if they are real, continue shaping human behavior and creativity. The shadow, personal and collective, continues causing the very problems Jung warned about. And somewhere, in some form Jung would appreciate, the dialogue continues between those who insist consciousness can be fully explained by brain chemistry and those who insist it cannot. Between those who see myths as primitive superstition and those who see them as profound wisdom. Between those who trust only external evidence and those who trust inner experience. Jung spent his life arguing for the legitimacy of inner experience, for the reality of the psyche as something more than epiphenomenon of neurons. Whether he was right is not a question that can be settled by any evidence he could provide. It is a question each person answers through their own experience of being conscious. What can be said with certainty is that the 3-year-old boy whose mother disappeared, whose father lost faith, who learned early that external authority is unreliable, grew into a man who trusted inner authority instead. And that trust led him to places so strange that a century later we are still trying to decide if he was mad or wise or somehow both. The psychiatrist who explored his own madness came back with maps. Whether the maps describe actual territory or beautiful fantasies is a question that will outlive everyone reading this. Because it is finally a question about the nature of consciousness itself, about what counts as real, about whether the invisible world is as legitimate a domain for human exploration as the visible one. Jung believed it was. He spent 85 years proving it to himself. Whether he proved it to anyone else remains forever open, which is perhaps appropriate for a man whose central message was that no one can give you meaning. You have to find it yourself, in your own depths, through your own confrontation with whatever you find there.